Today's topic is Scripture context. How the early church actually read Scripture, and why we don't anymore. Let's slow down and look at this carefully. Most Christians today believe something very specific, often without realizing it. That the Bible was written to be read privately, silently, individually, and literally, from beginning to end, by anyone, anywhere, at any time. But that assumption is very new. In fact, if you placed a modern Bible study into a second-century Christian gathering, it would feel unfamiliar. Not wrong, but deeply foreign. Tonight, we're going to explore how the early church actually encountered Scripture, and why our modern way of reading would have confused them. I am not here to take anything away from Scripture. I am here to return it to its original home. Let us considering a world without personal Bibles. History tells a quieter story. For the first 1,400 years of Christianity, the vast majority of believers did not own a Bible, could not read, never encountered Scripture silently. This is not speculation. It is historical fact. In the Roman Empire, literacy rates hovered between 5 to 15%. In many African and Near Eastern communities, literacy was even lower, but oral intelligence was extremely high. Scripture was not a book you owned. It was a story you entered. When Paul wrote a letter, say, to Corinth, that letter was delivered by a trusted messenger, read aloud, in one sitting, heard collectively, interpreted communally. There were no chapter numbers, no verse numbers, no study guides, just listening. Do you know that Scripture was heard, not scanned? Let's imagine a real scene. A small Christian gathering in Antioch, around AD 90. They meet in a home. Oil lamps flicker. People sit close. Children listen. Someone stands and reads a letter, perhaps one of the Gospels. And the community listens. With memory. With emotion. With cultural understanding. If you missed a line, you didn't rewind. You relied on communal memory. This trained Christians to hear Scripture as narrative, argument, moral formation, not as isolated quotes. This is why proof texting, the practice of pulling single verses to settle arguments, would have felt unnatural. Scripture was not ammunition. It was formation. Another thing we must affirm here is that culture was not an enemy of interpretation. This is where context matters. Early Christians did not pretend to be culture-free. They knew where they lived. A parable about seeds landed differently in Galilee than in Rome. A metaphor about slavery carried weight because slavery was visible, daily, embodied. When Jesus spoke of daily bread, no one spiritualized it. It meant survival. African communities understood this instinctively. In oral cultures, meaning is layered, not flattened. Stories are told with gesture, with repetition, with shared background knowledge. The early church read Scripture with culture, not against it. We need to discuss also when reading became private. Now let's trace the shift. Around the 15th century, three things changed everything. 1. The printing press. 2. Rising literacy. 3. Individual ownership of books. For the first time, Scripture became silent, private, portable, personal. These are not bad things, but they changed how Scripture was experienced. Reading moved from community rightward arrow to individual, from memory rightward arrow to reference, from formation rightward arrow to information. The Bible slowly became something to consult rather than enter. Also very important is the birth of proof texting. Verse numbers were added in the 1500s. Helpful? Yes. But dangerous, too. Once verses were numbered, they could be isolated, extracted, weaponized. The Bible became a collection of statements rather than a coherent story. This is how theology became fragmented. Disagreements became hardened. Faith became defensive. Early Christians argued, but they argued within shared stories, not isolated lines. Yes, you may want to know about African wisdom and oral scripture. This is where Africa re-enters the conversation. African societies preserved wisdom orally for centuries. Proverbs, epics, genealogies, law, theology. Truth was communal, not proprietary. Early African Christians, especially in Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia, understood scripture as lived wisdom, moral training, communal memory. They did not ask, "What does this verse say to me?" They asked, "What is this forming us into?" More important question is to know what we gained, what we lost. Let's be honest. Modern Bible reading gave us access, literacy, personal devotion, global distribution. But it also cost us patience, communal interpretation, historical humility. We gained information. We lost formation. The early church was not trying to win arguments. They were trying to become a people. 10. You would ask me how culture shapes interpretation today. Culture still shapes us whether we admit it or not. Western individualism trains us to read personally, immediately, practically. African and Eastern cultures often read collectively, patiently, relationally. Neither is perfect. But ignoring culture does not make us neutral. It makes us blind. It is now important to return to ancient practices, without romanticism. This is not a call to abandon modern tools. It is an invitation to read more slowly. Read in community. Read entire passages. Ask historical questions. Try this. Read a gospel chapter aloud, in one sitting. No stopping. No commentary. Then sit in silence. That is closer to how scripture was first encountered. In closing, you'll see a different kind of authority here. Let me leave you with this. The Bible does not lose authority when we read it in context. It regains it. Faith does not weaken when we ask how scripture was heard. It matures. What was never written is just as important as what was. Pause. If this resonated with you, sit with it. No urgency. No pressure. This channel is not here to convince you. It is here to show you.